Brussels, Belgium, May 19, 1943, 11:47 p.m. A 17-year-old resistance fighter named Henri Beaumont crouched in the shadow of a bombed-out bakery, his breath forming small clouds in the cold spring air. In his pocket, 3 pieces of white chalk. On the cobblestone street before him, Nazi patrols moved in predictable patterns, their boots echoing off the narrow walls of the Rue de la Regence. What happened in the next 6 minutes would turn a children's game into a weapon of war, and a terrified boy into a tactical genius the Gestapo would hunt for 2 years without ever learning his name. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Henri Beaumont was not supposed to be there. 3 months earlier, he had been a student at the École Royale Militaire, the son of a mathematics professor and a concert violinist. His childhood was measured in geometry proofs and piano scales, in the safe predictability of academic achievement. But war does not respect schedules or safety. When the Wehrmacht rolled through Belgium in May 1940, Henry's father was teaching a seminar on probability theory. By June, he was dead, shot in a reprisal execution after a railway sabotage he had nothing to do with. Henry's mother disappeared into a detention camp near Mechelen. Neighbors whispered she was sent east. No one said the word that everyone knew. Henri, at 14, learned what it meant to be alone in an occupied city where every street corner held either a collaborator or a corpse. He joined the resistance not through ideology but through necessity. A family friend, a man named Claude Vernet who ran a printing shop near the Bourse, brought him into a cell operating in the Morals district. They were not soldiers. They were teenagers, shopkeepers, a postal clerk, 2 university students, and an aging veteran of the Great War who could barely walk but could still field strip a Lebel rifle in darkness. Their operations were small, distributing underground newspapers, sheltering down Allied airmen, occasionally stealing German supplies, or cutting telephone lines. Nothing heroic. Nothing that would change the course of the war. Survival resistance. Claude called it. Keep the spirit alive until liberation comes. Do not die stupidly. Do not get caught. But Henri was not built for caution. His mind worked differently. Where others saw danger, he saw patterns. Where others memorized routes and schedules, Henri saw systems, sequences, predictable behaviors that could be mapped and exploited. It was his father's influence, the endless dinner table discussions about probability and chaos theory, about how complex outcomes emerge from simple rules. Henri began to study the German patrols with the same intensity he once applied to calculus problems. He timed them. He noted their routes, their rest stops, their shift changes. He mapped which streets they preferred, which alleys they avoided, how they responded to noises, to threats, to ambiguity. He filled 3 notebooks with observations written in tiny handwriting, codes only he understood. Claude thought he was obsessive. The others thought he was wasting time. But Henri was building something. He did not yet know what. The chalk marks began as a joke. Late April 1943. Henri and another boy, a 16-year-old named Luc who worked in his uncle's butcher shop, were returning from a supply drop near the Gare du Midi. They had stolen 2 crates of German medical supplies, morphine and bandages, intended for a resistance doctor operating out of a church basement in Ixelles. The streets were quiet, the curfew absolute. But at the intersection of Rue Haute and Rue de Renards, they froze. Voices, German voices, a patrol, for soldiers, moving toward them from the north. Another patrol, 3 soldiers, approaching from the east. Trapped, no time to run. The crates were too heavy to carry at speed. Doorways were locked, windows shuttered. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs. This was how it ended. 17 years old, caught with stolen Wehrmacht supplies, a bullet in the back of the head, if he was lucky, interrogation if he was not. Then Henri saw the chalk, a piece of yellow chalk lying in the gutter, dropped by some child before the war made childhood impossible. He grabbed it, and without thinking, without planning, he drew a large X on the cobblestones, then an arrow pointing down the Rue de Renards. Luc stared at him like he had lost his mind. "What are you doing?" Luc hissed. Henri did not answer. He ran 15 meters south, drew another X, another arrow, this time pointing west. Then he and Luke dragged the crates into a narrow gap between two buildings, a space barely wide enough for their bodies, and waited. The patrols arrived at the intersection simultaneously. They saw the marks. They hesitated. One soldier pointed at the arrows. Another spoke quickly in German. They assumed the marks were signals. Perhaps from another patrol. Perhaps from a collaborator informant. Perhaps from their own command. The two patrols split, following the arrows, moving away from Henri and Luke's hiding spot. Within 90 seconds, the intersection was empty. Henri and Luke waited 5 minutes, then carried the crates to safety. It should have been forgotten. A lucky accident. A moment of panic turned into fortune by coincidence. But Henri could not stop thinking about it. The Germans had seen marks on the ground and assumed they meant something. They had imposed order onto randomness. They had followed instructions that did not exist. And in doing so, they had behaved predictably. That night, lying on a thin mattress in the attic room he rented above a laundry, Henri began to sketch. If random marks could create confusion, what could intentional marks do? What if the marks were not random? What if they formed a system, a visual language that could coordinate movement without radios, without messengers, without any communication the Germans could intercept? He started experimenting. Over the next 2 weeks, Henri marked streets throughout the Morales with chalk, excess, circles, arrows, lines, numbers. He varied the colors, white, yellow, red where you find it. He placed them at intersections, on walls, near lampposts. Then he watched. He documented how people reacted. Most ignored them. Children played games with them. But the Germans always paused. They always looked. They always tried to interpret. Their training demanded it. Markings could indicate partisan activity, sabotage targets, safe houses. Every mark was a potential intelligence source. And that attention, that need to interpret, created a vulnerability. Henri brought his findings to Claude. The older man listened, skeptical but intrigued. "You want to use chalk to fight the Wehrmacht," Claude said, not mockingly, but with the tone of someone who had seen too many young men die from clever ideas. Henri shook his head. "Not fight, confuse, redirect, coordinate." He spread his notebooks across Claude's desk, showing the patrol patterns, the timings, the intersections where multiple routes converged. If we mark streets during an operation, we can guide the Germans away from our real position, or guide them into an ambush, or make them think an attack is coming from a different direction. We can communicate with our own people without radios, without runners, without anything the Gestapo can trace. Claude studied the notes. He asked questions. How do you prevent the Germans from learning the code? Henri explained it was not a code. It was adaptive. The marks would mean different things in different contexts on different nights. The meaning would come from prior briefing, from context, from the operation itself. The Germans would see marks but never understand the system because there was no fixed system to understand. Claude approved the test. Small scale, low risk, a supply theft from a Wehrmacht depot near the Porte de Hal. 6 resistance members, including Henri. The plan was simple. 2 members would create a distraction on the north side of the depot. The other 4 would enter from the south, grab whatever they could carry, and extract west. Henri spent the afternoon before the operation marking the streets. White chalk excess at intersections where patrols should be avoided. Yellow circles near safe routes. Red arrows pointing toward the extraction point. He briefed the team. If separated, follow the yellow circles. If pursued, lead them toward the white excess where other patrols will converge and cause confusion. Do not deviate. Trust the marks. The operation launched at 10:15 p.m. The distraction worked. Explosion, small firecrackers. Enough noise to draw guards north. The 4-man team entered the depot, grabbed ammunition crates and medical supplies, and began extraction. But then everything collapsed. A patrol appeared early, off schedule, moving south along their extraction route. The team scattered. Henri and another member, a university student named Emile, ran west. 2 others ran east. The patrol gave chase. Henri ran through streets he had marked hours earlier. He saw the yellow circles and turned, Emile following. Behind them, German voices, boots, the metallic click of rifles being readied. They rounded a corner. Ahead, a white X. Henri skidded to a stop, pulled Emil into a doorway. Seconds later, the pursuing patrol ran past the white X and directly into another German patrol moving perpendicular. Collision, confusion, shouting in German. The two patrols assumed they were chasing the same target in opposite directions. By the time they sorted themselves out, Henri and Emil had vanished through a network of alleys marked with yellow circles. The entire team extracted successfully. 0 casualties. Germans spent the next hour chasing ghosts. Word spread through the resistance network. Other cells wanted to learn the method. Henri began teaching, but he emphasized adaptation over replication. The marks are not magic, he explained. They only work if the enemy believes they might mean something. And if your own people know the context, change the colors, change the symbols. Never use the same pattern twice in the same area. The moment it becomes predictable, it becomes useless. Some cells adopted variations. Others failed, marking streets too obviously or using patterns the Germans deciphered. But Henri's cell, under Claude's leadership, refined the technique into an art form. By mid-May 1943, they were operating twice a week. Sabotage, supply theft, intelligence gathering. The chalk marks became central to every operation. Henri developed layers of meaning. Primary marks for navigation. Secondary marks to indicate danger zones. Decoy marks to mislead German follow-up investigations. He began using the marks not just defensively but offensively, creating false trails that led patrols into dead ends or away from actual operations. On one occasion, he marked an entire district to suggest a resistance safe house was located in a building that was actually a Gestapo administrative office. The Germans raided their own people, but success breeds attention. The Gestapo noticed the marks. Reports filtered up through Wehrmacht intelligence. Streets in the Morals district showed patterns of chalk markings coinciding with resistance activity. An investigation was launched. Gestapo officers photographed the marks, cataloged them, tried to find the code. They arrested children suspected of making the marks. They interrogated shopkeepers. They assigned analysts to break the system. But there was no system to break. The marks were context-dependent, operation-specific, adaptive. The meaning existed only in the briefings Henri gave his team before each operation. The Gestapo was trying to solve a puzzle that reconfigured itself every night. Then came May 19, 1943. The operation was supposed to be straightforward. A Gestapo officer named Hauptsturmführer Klaus Ritter was scheduled to travel through Moral's district at approximately midnight, moving from Gestapo headquarters near the Place Royale to a detention facility in Anderlecht. Intelligence suggested he carried documents, names of resistance members, interrogation transcripts, evidence that could destroy a dozen cells. The order from the resistance command was clear. Intercept. Retrieve the documents. Eliminate Ritter if possible. Claude assigned the operation to Henri's cell. 8 members. 2 vehicles. 1 chance. Henri spent the day mapping the route. Ritter would travel in a staff car with 2 motorcycle escorts, front and rear. His route would take him down the Rue de la Regence, through the Place Pollard, then west toward Anderlecht. The problem was the escorts. In an open street engagement, the resistance would lose. They had pistols and 2 stolen MP-40 submachine guns. The Germans had training, armor, and backup minutes away. A direct ambush would be suicide. Henri needed to separate the escorts from the staff car, create confusion, and extract before reinforcements arrived. And he needed to do it in a district where German patrols were now hyper-alert to chalk markings. He designed the marks to work in layers. First layer, navigation for his own team. Yellow circles on the south side of streets marking safe positions. White circles on the north side marking fallback routes. Second layer, misdirection for the Germans. Red excess at intersections where resistance members would create diversions, drawing patrols away from the ambush zone. Third layer, the ambush itself. Henri marked the Rue de la Regence with a pattern designed to split the convoy. He placed a large white X with an arrow pointing east at an intersection 1 block before the ambush point. Standard German procedure when encountering suspicious markings was to investigate. Henri was betting that the lead motorcycle escort would pause or divert to check the mark, separating from the staff car. Then, 50 meters further, he placed a yellow circle with a red slash, a meaningless symbol he had never used before. Its only purpose was to create hesitation, to make Ritter's driver slow down, giving the resistance team the seconds they needed to act. The team assembled at 11:30 p.m. Henri briefed them in a basement workshop beneath a tailor's shop. He drew the route on a chalkboard, marked the positions, explained the timing. Emil and 2 others would create diversions near the red XS, firecrackers and noise. Nothing that would cause real alarm, but enough to draw patrol attention. Henri and 3 others, including Claude, would position themselves along the Rue de la Regence at the ambush point. The 8th member, a woman named Sophie who worked as a nurse, would wait with a vehicle 2 blocks west for extraction. The plan relied on split-second timing. If the convoys stayed together, if the marks failed to create separation, they would abort. No heroes, no last stands. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. Henri took his position at 11:47 p.m., crouched in the shadow of the bombed-out bakery. The street was narrow, buildings on both sides, minimal light. Perfect for an ambush if they could isolate the target. He carried a Luger pistol taken from a dead German soldier 2 months earlier. Claude positioned himself across the street with an MP40. The other 2 members flanked the intersection, ready to block escape routes. Henri felt his heart pounding. This was different from theft operations, from sabotage. This was direct confrontation. People were going to die tonight. Possibly him. At 11:52 p.m., he heard the engines. Low rumble, motorcycles and a car, approaching from the east. Henri watched the intersection where he had placed a white X with the arrow. The lead motorcycle appeared first, headlight cutting through darkness. It reached the X and slowed. The driver gestured to his passenger, pointing at the mark. They stopped. The passenger dismounted, crouched to examine the mark, looked down the street the arrow indicated. The staff car appeared, slowed, but continued forward, separating from the lead escort by 30 meters. The rear motorcycle stayed with the car. So far, the plan was working. The convoy was now strung out, segmented, vulnerable. The staff car reached the yellow circle with the red slash. The driver saw it, hesitated, slowed further. Henri raised his hand, signaled to Claude. The ambush triggered. Claude stepped from the shadows and fired the MP40 in a short burst, aiming for the rear motorcycle. The motorcycle went down, driver and passenger thrown to the cobblestones. Henri sprinted toward the staff car, Luger raised. The driver tried to accelerate, but one of the resistance members threw a metal chain across the street at ankle height. The car swerved, clipped the chain, tire blew. The car lurched to stop. Ritter emerged from the rear door, pistol drawn, firing wildly. Henri dug behind a stone planter, felt bullets crack the air above him. Behind them, the lead motorcycle escort had realized the ambush and was racing back toward the fight. 30 seconds, maybe less, before they arrived. Henri popped up, fired twice, missed. Ritter fired back, hit the planter. Stone fragments stung Henri's face. Claude circled from the opposite side, fired another burst, hit Ritter in the shoulder. The Gestapo officer went down, dropped his pistol, clutched his wound. Henri ran forward, grabbed Ritter's briefcase on the car floor, and turned to run. But the lead motorcycle was already there. Rounding the corner, passenger raising a submachine gun. This was the moment Henri had not planned for. The moment where the marks meant nothing, and survival was just speed and luck. He ran west, legs pumping, briefcase clutched to his chest. Behind him, gunfire, shouting, chaos. He saw a yellow circle on the north side of the street, his fallback route mark. He turned, sprinted into an alley. Behind him, the motorcycle followed, engine roaring. The alley narrowed. Henri vaulted a low wall, landed hard, kept running. He saw another yellow circle ahead. Followed it left into a courtyard. The motorcycle could not follow. He heard the riders dismount, heard boots hitting pavement. They were chasing on foot now. Henri's lungs burned. His vision tunneled. He saw a white circle, another fallback mark. followed it through a gap between buildings so narrow he had to turn sideways. Behind him, the Germans were losing ground. They did not know the marks. They did not know the routes. They were running blind while Henri was running a map course he had memorized. He emerged onto a side street and saw Sophie's vehicle, engine running, door open. He threw himself inside. Sophie accelerated before the door closed. Behind them, the Germans emerged from the alley, fired after the vehicle. Bullets sparked off cobblestones, but they were gone, disappearing into a maze of blacked-out streets, following yellow circles that led them to a route Henri had marked that afternoon specifically for this escape. They reached the safe house at 12:17 a.m. Henri's hands were shaking so badly he could barely open a briefcase. Inside, documents, lists of names, interrogation schedules, addresses of suspected resistance members, and maps, Gestapo maps of the Morales district, with every chalk mark Henri had made over the past month photographed and cataloged. The Germans had been closer to understanding the system than Henri realized, but they had failed to grasp the central principle. The marks were not a language. They were a weapon that only worked because the enemy believed they were a language. Claude extracted the critical documents and burned the rest. The names were passed to other cells, warnings issued, people evacuated. 3 families disappeared into hiding before the Gestapo could arrest them. Ritter survived his wound but was reassigned. The convoy ambush became legend within the resistance network. The boy who used chalk to fight the Wehrmacht. But Henri did not feel legendary. He felt exhausted, and he felt the weight of what he had done. He had shot at men. Men had shot at him. Ritter might die from his wounds. The motorcycle driver Claude had shot was certainly dead. This was not stealing supplies or cutting phone lines. This was war, intimate and brutal. The Gestapo intensified their crackdown. The chalk marks were now a priority target. They assigned a full counterintelligence unit to decode the system. They arrested anyone found with chalk. They scrubbed streets clean every morning. But Henri adapted. He stopped using chalk in high-traffic areas. He switched to other methods: scratches on walls, arrangements of stones, patterns of debris. The principle remained. Create signals the enemy notices but cannot interpret. Use their attention against them. Make them see meaning where there is only noise. Over the summer of 1943, Henri's cell conducted 17 operations using the marking system. 13 succeeded completely. 3 were compromised, but the team extracted safely. 1 failed catastrophically when a collaborator betrayed the operation, and the Germans were waiting at the ambush point. 2 resistance members died. Henri was not present for that operation, but he felt responsible. His system had created overconfidence. People began to believe the marks made them invincible. Claude pulled the cell back, suspended operations for 3 weeks. They mourned. They reassessed. And Henri spent long nights wondering if his cleverness had killed his friends. In September, the Gestapo finally captured a resistance member who understood the marking system. Under interrogation, he broke. He explained the adaptive nature, the context dependence, the briefings before operations. The Gestapo realized they had been chasing a phantom code. There was no key to find, no cipher to break. The system existed in the minds of the resistance members, not on the streets. Furious, they changed tactics. They stopped trying to decode the marks and started using them as bait. They created their own marks, hoping to draw resistance members into traps. But Henri saw through it immediately. The Gestapo marks were too perfect, too systematic. Real resistance marks were hasty, imperfect, adapted to the moment. Henri trained his cell to recognize the fakes. The Gestapo caught no one. By early 1944, the marking system had spread to resistance cells across Brussels and into other Belgian cities. Liège, Antwerp, Ghent. Each cell adapted it to their own needs, their own streets, their own enemy patterns. The Germans knew it was happening, but could not stop it. Every mark could be real or could be meaningless. Every street could be a trap or could be nothing. The uncertainty consumed resources, diverted patrols, created paranoia, which was exactly the point. Henri had not set out to kill Germans. He had set out to make them waste time, second-guess themselves, see threats everywhere. In a war of limited resources, uncertainty was a weapon. Henri himself barely survived to see liberation. In March 1944, a Gestapo raid hit Claude's printing shop. Claude was arrested. Under torture, he gave up nothing, but the Gestapo had membership lists from other sources. They began rolling up the network. Henri went deep underground, moving between safe houses every few nights, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. He continued operations, but smaller now, alone or with one other person. The marks still worked, but the cost was unbearable. Friends disappeared, some into prisons, some into mass graves. Sophie was caught running a medical aid station and deported. Emile was shot trying to escape a raid. By August 1944, Henri was 17 and felt 50. He had killed 4 men. He had watched 8 friends die. He had lived on adrenaline and fear for so long that normal sensation felt alien. When the Allies liberated Brussels on September 3, 1944, Henri stood in the Place de Brucaire and watched British tanks roll through the streets and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just a vast emptiness where his adolescence should have been. After the war, Henri did not speak about the chalk marks. He did not seek recognition. He testified at war crimes trials, helped identify collaborators, and then disappeared into civilian life. He finished his education, became a teacher, married, had children. He taught mathematics at a secondary school in Schaerbeek for 33 years. His students never knew. His colleagues never knew. Even his wife knew only fragments. It was not shame. It was simply that the war had taken something from him that explanations could not restore. The boy who had played with probability and chalk was gone, replaced by a man who understood that survival was luck and that cleverness could kill as easily as it could save. Claude survived the camps, barely. He and Henri reunited in 1945. They met once a year, always on May 19th, always at the same cafe near the Rue de la Regence. They never discussed the ambush. They never discussed the marks. They just sat together. 2 men who had lived through something that could not be spoken. Claude died in 1963. Henri continued the tradition alone, sitting at the cafe each May 19th, drinking coffee, remembering. In 1978, a military historian researching Belgian resistance operations discovered references to the chalk marking system in Gestapo archives captured after the war. The Germans had documented it extensively, frustrated by their inability to counter it. The historian tracked down Henri, now 52 and teaching calculus to bored teenagers. Henri agreed to an interview. He explained the system, the theory, the operations. The historian was amazed. This was tactical innovation born from desperation, executed by untrained civilians, yet effective enough to occupy German counterintelligence resources for over a year. "Why did you never publish this?" the historian asked. "Why did you let it be forgotten?" Henri looked at him for a long moment. "Because it was not about the marks," he said. "It was about the people who used them. Most of them are dead. The marks were just chalk. They washed away in the rain. The people did not come back." The historian published a paper in 1980, documenting the chalk marking resistance technique. It was read by military theorists, by intelligence professionals, by historians of unconventional warfare. The concept of adaptive visual signaling without centralized codes influenced modern urban combat doctrine. Special forces units incorporated variations into training, but Henri's name appeared in the paper only as a footnote, at his request. Henri Beaumont died in 1996, age 70. His obituary in L'Histoire mentioned his career as a teacher, his love of chess, his grandchildren. It did not mention the war. It did not mention that he had turned a child's toy into a weapon that had saved dozens of lives and tormented the Gestapo. At his funeral, 3 elderly men attended who were not family. They stood at the back, did not speak, and left white chalk marks on the church steps before they departed. No one knew what the marks meant. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Perhaps just a memory of a boy who had understood that meaning itself could be a battlefield. The final analysis came from the Gestapo's own reports, declassified decades after the war. A memo from November 1943, written by a frustrated intelligence officer assigned to the chalk mark investigation, concluded that the system was fundamentally unbreakable not because of sophistication, but because of simplicity. The resistance had weaponized ambiguity. They had made the Germans afraid of children's drawings. And in doing so, they had proven that the most dangerous weapon in war is not technology or firepower. It is the ability to make your enemy doubt what they see, to turn their own attention into a liability, to make them chase ghosts drawn in chalk on cobblestones. Henri would have appreciated the irony. He had not been a soldier. He had not been a spy. He had been a 17-year-old boy with 3 pieces of chalk and a theory about probability. And he had turned a joke, a moment of panic-driven improvisation, into a technique that military historians would study 70 years later. Not because it was complex, but because it understood something fundamental about human psychology. We see patterns. We impose meaning. We follow signals. And when someone understands that, when someone can manipulate that instinct, they hold a power that no amount of training or technology can defend against. The chalk marks of Brussels were never replicated exactly. Other resistance movements tried variations, some successfully, others disastrously, but the principle endured. In modern conflicts, in urban warfare, in counterinsurgency operations, the lesson remains. The battlefield is not just physical space. It is also perceptual space, the space of attention and interpretation and belief. Whoever controls what the enemy sees and thinks they understand controls the fight. Henri Beaumont knew that at 17. The Wehrmacht learned at the cost of dozens of failed operations, wasted resources, and a paranoia that turned every street corner in Brussels into a potential trap. And perhaps that is a real legacy. Not the specific technique, not the chalk or the marks or the ambush on the Rue de la Regence, but the idea that ordinary people with ordinary tools can reshape the geometry of conflict if they understand the human element, if they see not just the terrain, but the psychology, if they remember that the enemy is not a machine but a collection of individuals trying to make sense of chaos, and that chaos itself can be a weapon if you know how to wield it. Henri's students at the secondary school in Schaerbeek learned mathematics. They learned equations and proofs, and the elegant logic of numbers. They did not learn that their quiet, kind teacher had once stood in a dark street with a pistol in his hand and a briefcase full of stolen Gestapo documents. His survival depended on marks he had drawn that afternoon with chalk stolen from a schoolyard. They did not learn that the man who graded their exams had graded himself on a different scale, one measure in operations completed and friends still alive. They did not learn that the careful way he taught them to break down complex problems into simple steps came from nights spent breaking down patrol routes and timing sequences and human behavior into variables that could be predicted and exploited. But perhaps they learned something more important. They learned from Henri that problems have solutions, that obstacles have weaknesses, that systems can be understood and therefore changed. They learned that careful observation matters, that patterns reveal vulnerabilities, that creativity is not opposed to discipline, but is its highest expression. They learned these things in the context of mathematics, but Henri knew they applied far beyond. He had lived the proof. In his final years, when dementia began to take his memories, Henri would sometimes wake in the night convinced he was back in the Morals, back in 1943, listening for the sound of German patrols. His wife would calm him, remind him where he was, when he was... But before the confusion cleared, he would always check his pockets for chalk, just in case, just to be ready. The war had ended 50 years earlier, but the habits of survival do not retire. The instinct to mark the route, to prepare the escape, to think 3 moves ahead, these things have become part of him at 17 and remained until the end. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. The bombed-out bakery on the Rue de la Regence, where Henri crouched that night in May 1943, was rebuilt after the war. It is now a chocolate shop, selling pralines to tourists who walk the streets of Brussels without knowing what happened there. No plaque marks the location. No memorial explains that this nondescript corner was once the site of a perfect ambush coordinated by chalk marks. History does not preserve everything. Most of it washes away like chalk in the rain. But some stories survive, pass through military archives and historian interviews, and old men who meet in cafes to remember friends who did not come home. Henri Beaumont was not a hero in the classical sense. He did not storm bunkers or lead charges. He did not give speeches or plant flags. He was a scared boy who got clever, because clever was the only weapon he had. He turned a piece of chalk into a tactical system because he understood that war is not just violence. It is also communication, interpretation, perception. It is a contest not just of strength, but of sense-making. And in that contest, a 17-year-old with a background in mathematics and a willingness to experiment found an edge that professional soldiers had missed. The mark of true innovation is that it seems obvious in retrospect. Of course, visual signals can coordinate movement. Of course, the enemy will try to interpret them. Of course, you can exploit that. But obvious is not the same as easy. Someone had to see it first. Someone had to test it when the cost of failure was death. Someone had to refine it under pressure and teach it to others and adapt when the enemy adapted. Henri did that. And he did it while most of his peers were studying for university exams and worry about things that mattered in peacetime. War steals youth. It takes the years when people should be discovering who they are and replaces them with lessons about who they must become to survive. Henri lost his adolescence to a conflict he did not start, fighting an enemy he did not choose, using methods no manual taught. The chalk marks were born from that loss, from the desperation of people trying to fight back with whatever tools they could improvise. And in that improvisation, in that refusal to accept that superior force guaranteed defeat, something remarkable emerged. Not just a technique, a philosophy, the idea that the disadvantaged can win if they change the rules, if they fight on a different plane where strength matters less than understanding. The Germans never captured Henri. They never learned his name during the war. After liberation, when they reconstructed resistance networks for war crimes investigations, his identity emerged, but by then it was too late for retribution and too early for recognition. He slipped through history's fingers, neither punished nor celebrated, which suited him perfectly. He had not fought for glory. He had fought to survive, to protect his friends, to resist in the only ways available. The marks were a tool, nothing more. That they became something studied and analyzed decades later would have bemused him. In the end, the story of the chalk marks is not about chalk. It is about a moment when a terrified boy grabbed a piece of yellow chalk from a gutter and made a mark that saved his life. It is about how that moment became a method, and how that method became a system, and how that system became a small but real thorn in the side of an occupying army. It is about how ordinary tools in creative hands can become extraordinary weapons. It is about how the human mind, when pressed by necessity, can find solutions that seem to come from nowhere, but actually come from the same place all innovation comes from. The intersection of knowledge, desperation, and the willingness to try something that might fail. The last chalk mark Henri ever made was in 1994, 2 years before his death. He was visiting the Rue de la Regence, standing near the chocolate shop that had once been a bombed-out bakery. He had a piece of white chalk in his pocket, carried for reasons he could not fully articulate. He looked around, saw no one watching, and drew a small circle on the cobblestones. Just a circle. No arrow, no X, no meaning that anyone else could decipher. Just a mark, a memory, a signature left by a man who had once been a boy trying to survive. The rain washed it away that night, but Henri had not made it to last. He had made it to remember, and having remembered, he walked away, back to his ordinary life, back to the person he had built from the ruins of his youth. The war was over. The marks were gone. But the boy who drew them, the boy who turned a joke into a battle plan, that boy remained, somewhere beneath the layers of years, still ready, still watching, still marking routes just in case.